I was being brought to set in a wheelchair. Like, I couldn't walk that far. So I had to tell everybody because I needed help. You know, I needed someone to help me stand, and I needed someone to help. I needed someone to help me to get there.
For years, Florida has been fighting a war it never asked for. Somewhere out in the swamps, marshes, and canals of the Everglades, an invader has been quietly taking over. And it isn't just a handful of stray animals. Scientists now estimate that somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 Burmese pythons are living wild across the state's subtropical regions. That number is staggering enough on its own. But what makes it worse is how these snakes got there in the first place, and just how badly they've torn apart one of the most fragile ecosystems on the planet. So when Florida officials announced their plan to fight back, a lot of people online reacted the same way, with jokes. Because the plan wasn't guns, traps, or bounty hunters alone. It involved releasing thousands of other creatures into the wild. Creatures whose entire purpose was to hunt, kill, and in some cases even track down the invaders from the inside. To outsiders, it sounded like something out of a bad monster movie. Fight snakes with more snakes. Release predators to solve a predator problem? It seemed absurd. But the truth behind this story is far stranger, far more scientific, and far more effective than anyone expected. And once you understand how deep this crisis actually goes, the plan doesn't sound crazy anymore. It sounds like the only option Florida had left. The story of the Burmese python invasion starts decades ago, and almost nobody saw it coming. Burmese pythons are native to Southeast Asia, where they live in swamps, grasslands, and jungles. They are not supposed to exist anywhere near the Everglades. But sometime in the 1970s, that changed. Pet owners who could no longer handle these massive constrictors and breeders whose animals escaped during storms and enclosure failures allowed the species to slip into the wild. In a place like South Florida, with its warm, wet, swampy terrain, the pythons found something close to paradise. There were no natural predators large enough to threaten a full-grown python. There was an endless buffet of native wildlife that had never evolved defenses against a 150-pound ambush predator. And there was room to spread, undetected, for years. By the time officials realized how serious the problem had become, the snakes were already thriving. A single female python can lay between 50 and 100 eggs in a single clutch. Multiply that across an unknown but massive population, hidden in dense marshland where they are almost impossible to spot, and you get a mathematical nightmare. Researchers have noted that only around 5% of pythons in the Everglades are ever seen by the average person walking through the area. The other 95% are moving, hunting, and breeding completely undetected. That's not just an invasive species problem. That's a slow-motion ecological collapse. The impact on native wildlife has been brutal. Pythons prey on birds, mammals, and other reptiles, and in areas with heavy python activity, populations of rabbits, raccoons, opossums, and other mid-sized mammals have crashed by shocking margins. Predators further up the food chain, like the endangered Florida panther and native bobcats, have been robbed of their traditional prey. Even alligators, once considered the undisputed top predator of the Everglades, have found themselves in direct competition, and sometimes direct combat, with these newcomers. The invasive species didn't just add another predator to the ecosystem. It rewired the entire food web. Florida's initial response was straightforward: send people in to physically remove the snakes. This gave rise to programs like the Python Elimination Program, run through the South Florida Water Management District, which pays contractors to search designated public lands and physically capture and euthanize pythons. Compensation is based on the size of the snake and where it's captured, with additional bonuses for the longest catches and the most active hunters. It's a strange job by any normal standard, trudging through waist-deep swamp water, at night, searching for an ambush predator that can grow to lengths exceeding 15 feet, but it has become a genuine profession for a small army of specialized hunters. Alongside that program came something even more publicly visible: the Florida Python Challenge, an annual 10-day competition that invites both professional hunters and everyday members of the public to head into the Everglades and remove as many pythons as they can. The event offers substantial prize money, with a $10,000 top prize and thousands more distributed across categories like longest snake captured. Hundreds of competitors sign up every year, some local, some flying in from other countries entirely, all chasing both the payout and the thrill of hunting one of the most elusive predators in North America. Every hunter is required to complete a safety course before entering the field, and strict rules govern how the animals must be humanely euthanized, since improper method can cause prolonged suffering due to the snake's unusually slow metabolism. These human-powered efforts have made a real dent. Since the year 2000, more than 23,000 wild Burmese pythons have been removed from Florida and formally reported to the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. That's a genuinely impressive number. But conservationists have been blunt about the math. With an estimated wild population reaching into the hundreds of thousands, human hunters alone were never going to be enough. Florida needed something that could work at a scale no team of people ever could. It needed nature to start fighting back on its own terms. This is where the story takes its strange turn, and where the internet jokes really started. Because the next major weapon in Florida's arsenal wasn't a trap, a drone, or chemical repellent. It was a snake. Specifically, the eastern indigo snake, a massive, glossy, iridescent black native predator that can grow to nearly 9 feet in length and has a reputation among biologists as one of the most powerful natural predators in the entire region. Eastern indigo snakes are not venomous. They don't need to be. Instead, they rely on sheer size, strength, and an almost fearless hunting style. Indigo snakes are famous among herpetologists for something most other snake species simply don't do. They actively hunt and eat other snakes, including venomous ones like rattlesnakes and cottonmouths, snakes that would kill nearly any other predator that tried to take them on. Field biologists describe them as apex hunters that will eat virtually anything that moves in front of them. Birds, small mammals, and yes, other reptiles, including invasive species. The problem was that Florida had already nearly wiped this creature out. Eastern indigo snakes were listed as a federally endangered species back in 1978, after decades of habitat destruction from development, agriculture, and urban sprawl tore apart the longleaf pine forests and sandy uplands they depend on. For a long time, it looked like the species might disappear from large parts of its historic range entirely. So the idea of intentionally releasing thousands of indigo snakes back into the wild wasn't just a python control strategy. It was also framed by conservationists as an attempt to undo decades of damage and restore a species that Florida itself had helped push to the edge. The organization spearheading this effort is the Orion Center for Indigo Conservation, based in Eustis in Central Florida. For nearly a decade now, the center has been breeding eastern indigo snakes in captivity and releasing them into carefully chosen habitats across North Florida and into parts of southern Alabama. What started as a small, experimental program has grown steadily larger every year. In the program's most recent and largest release to date, 42 eastern indigo snakes bred and hatched at the center were set loose into the wild in a single batch, the biggest single release the program has ever conducted. Field biologists working on the project have been careful not to oversell the program as some kind of instant fix. It's slow, methodical work, but there are genuinely encouraging signs. Researchers have documented evidence of wild reproduction among the released snakes, meaning the population isn't just surviving out there. It's starting to breed and sustain itself naturally, which is the ultimate marker of a successful reintroduction. As one field biologist at the center put it, indigo snakes function as a large natural predator for the animals where they live, hunting birds, small rodents, and other venomous or invasive snakes to help keep entire local ecosystems in balance. What's remarkable is how this program flips the usual invasive species narrative on its head. In most cases, Florida is trying to remove something that doesn't belong. Hey, officials are doing the opposite, restoring a native species that was nearly lost, specifically because that native species is uniquely equipped to fight back against the invaders. It isn't a foreign solution being forced onto the ecosystem. It's the ecosystem's own long-lost defender being given a second chance. Of course, biologists are honest about the uncertainties that remain. It's still unclear exactly how many of the released snakes survive over the long term. or how effectively they'll be able to re-establish themselves across the wider range they once occupied generations ago. And it remains an open question whether the program will eventually expand into new regions beyond North Florida and South Alabama. But after 9 years of steady releases, growing population numbers, and now documented wild breeding, what began as a long-shot conservation experiment is starting to look like one of the more promising tools in Florida's fight to rebalance its ecosystem. While indigo snakes handle the ground-level predator work, Florida has also been investing in far more sophisticated, almost science fiction-sounding tactics to track down pythons that even the best human hunters can't find. One of the strangest and most effective is something researchers call the Judas snake method. It works exactly like it sounds. Biologists capture a python, surgically implant a small radio transmitter inside its body, and then release it back into the wild. From that point on, the tagged snake, betraying its own kind, hence the nickname, leads researchers straight to python breeding aggregations and hidden congregation sites that would otherwise be nearly impossible to locate in dense, swampy terrain. The Conservancy of Southwest Florida has taken this approach and scaled it up dramatically, maintaining a network of roughly 40 tagged male scout snakes that lead trained teams to mating groups during the breeding season, allowing biologists to capture both the males and the much larger, egg-bearing females before they ever get the chance to reproduce. The results have been extraordinary. In one recent season alone, the Conservancy's team removed 177 Burmese pythons from a 200-square-mile stretch of Collier County, totaling over 8,000 pounds of invasive predator pulled directly out of the ecosystem, the largest single-season biomass removal in the organization's history. On top of the adult snakes captured, the team also eliminated more than 4,100 python eggs before they could ever hatch. According to the Conservancy's science project manager, tagged scout snakes have helped researchers locate large breeding females deep in the landscape before they had a chance to lay eggs, a strategy that is actively suppressing local python reproduction rather than just reacting to it after the fact. Since the program's founding back in 2013, it has removed more than 1,700 pythons weighing over 53,000 pounds combined, and the data collected along the way has contributed to more than 24 scientific publications on python behavior, reproduction, and habitat use, research that continues shaping how the state manages the crisis moving forward. Florida has also partnered with private industry to accelerate the effort even further. Through a collaboration between the state's wildlife agency and a Miami-based biotech company, python removal numbers have surged dramatically. In just 3 months during the summer of 2025, more than 1,000 pythons were removed, compared to roughly a third of that number during the same period the year before, with July alone accounting for more captures than the entire previous year combined. State officials have credited targeted funding and new partnerships with dramatically increasing efficiency, cutting management workload while simultaneously increasing pay and incentives for the hunters doing the difficult, dangerous field work on the ground. To really understand why Florida turned to such an unconventional strategy, it helps to understand just how unique the state's relationship with invasive species actually is. Florida's climate is almost perfectly engineered to let non-native animals thrive. Warm temperatures year-round, high humidity, dense wetlands, and a massive pet trade industry combine to create a kind of perfect storm. Burmese pythons are far from the only uninvited guest. Green iguanas have overrun neighborhoods across South Florida, chewing through landscaping and occasionally falling out of trees during cold snaps. Argentine black and white tigers, another large reptile with a taste for eggs and small animals, have established breeding populations that threaten ground-nesting birds and even alligator nests. Lionfish, native to the Indo-Pacific, have spread through Florida's coastal reefs with almost no natural predators, decimating native fish populations. Feral hogs tear through agricultural land and wetlands alike, causing hundreds of millions of dollars in damage every year. Against that backdrop, the python crisis isn't an isolated event. It's the most dramatic chapter in a much longer story about what happens when an ecosystem as delicate as the Everglades collides with global trade, exotic pet ownership, and a climate that welcomes almost anything willing to make the swamp its home. Florida wildlife officials have had to become some of the most experienced invasive species managers on the planet, simply out of necessity. And that experience is exactly what shaped the decision to bring back the eastern indigo snake rather than reach for another artificial or imported fix. Officials had already watched what happens when a species is introduced without fully understanding the consequences. The last thing anyone wanted was to solve one invasive species crisis by accidentally creating another. There's a reason biologists didn't consider using any other predator for this job. The eastern indigo snake checked every box a reintroduction program needs. It's native, meaning it evolved alongside the exact plants, prey animals, and climate conditions found throughout its range. So there was no risk of the same runaway population explosion that happens when a foreign species is dropped into an unfamiliar environment. It's non-venomous, which makes it dramatically safer for release programs working near populated areas compared to relying on more dangerous predators. And most importantly, it has a documented, well-studied history of preying on other snakes, including species that are themselves dangerous to humans and other wildlife. That last point matters more than people realize. Most predators avoid venomous snakes entirely, for obvious reasons. But indigo snakes have evolved a level of resistance and hunting confidence that lets them take down rattlesnakes, cottonmouths, and other venomous natives without hesitation. Applied to the invasive species crisis, that same instinct extends to non-native constrictors and other invasive reptiles sharing their territory. Indigo snakes aren't picky eaters. Field researchers describe them consuming birds, frogs, small mammals, and other reptiles, essentially functioning as a generalist top predator that keeps a wide range of species in check rather than focusing narrowly on just one target. There's also a practical logistical advantage that made this approach appealing to wildlife managers. Unlike large-scale human hunting operations, which require paying contractors, running competitions, and coordinating public outreach, a self-sustaining predator population works around the clock, in terrain no human hunter could safely or efficiently patrol. Indigo snakes don't need flashlights, boats, or safety courses. They simply live in the habitat, hunting exactly the way they have for millions of years, long before invasive species ever became a problem for the region. Once a population is established and breeding on its own, it becomes a long-term, low-cost solution that keeps working without continued human intervention, something none of Florida's other python control programs can claim. It's easy to overlook just how much money and manpower has gone into Florida's invasive species battle. The state's initial investment in its most recent python removal partnership alone totaled $2 million, funding that officials credited with dramatically increasing removal efficiency within a matter of months. Layer on top of that the ongoing costs of the python elimination program's hourly rates and length-based bonuses, the prize pools funded for the annual Python Challenge, the operational costs of running a conservation breeding center like the Orient Center year-round, and the research funding required to support radio telemetry studies and scientific publications. And the total investment climbs into the tens of millions of dollars over the past decade. Supporters of these programs argue the spending is easily justified by what's at stake. The Everglades isn't just a scenic wetland. It's a critical water source for millions of Floridians, a nursery for countless species of fish and birds, and a natural flood buffer for a state that faces increasingly severe storms.